Welcome to the pilot episode of While You Whistle, where I expose the double standards giving rise to the mistreatment of minorities in society. I'm your host, Xingyi Yang, a freshman at Boston University majoring in biochemistry and molecular biology. But right now, I'll be putting that aside to embrace the humanities and social issues for a little while. Roll intro. You know, it's funny how one spontaneous decision influences your life down the line. Like, I picked up this book a while back in New York from a random bookstore that my friends and I just happened to walk by. And I was into crime novels back then. Well, to be honest, I still am now. But this book really caught my eye. And it's called Unwanted: The Persecution of an American Whistleblower by Jeffrey Sterling. And I actually have it with me right now. And it's about how Sterling, who is a Black CIA agent, just to give some context, was tried and then convicted of, quote, leaking classified information related to CIA operations, end quote, to a reporter called James Risen. And so the specific operation that Sterling is referring to is called Operation Merlin. And so Operation Merlin was a failed scheme to, quote, derail the Iranian effort to build a nuclear bomb by providing scientists with fake, flawed blueprints for warheads. And the blueprints were channeled through a Russian scientist, end quote. And the plan ultimately backfired when the Iranian experts detected the fraud. And so the operation was a failure. And then the reporter James Risen exposed this by writing his book called State of War. And it made the agency leaders at the CIA really, really mad. Like, they were furious that their incompetence was exposed. And so, in their eagerness to punish someone for their embarrassment, they looked around for a scapegoat or someone to take all the blame, someone to throw under the bus. And then they chose Jeffrey Sterling to take all the blame. And they claimed that he gave information to the reporter that ultimately made them look bad. And so Sterling was charged with 9 criminal charges, including unlawful retention and unauthorized disclosure of national defense information, mail fraud, unauthorized conveyance of government property, and obstruction of justice, just to name a few. And that was all under the accusation that he was the one to talk to that reporter. And so in Sterling's book, he writes that, quote, he did not leak any classified information related to CIA operations to James Risen or to anyone else, end quote. However, he does brand himself as a whistleblower, but the only thing he claimed to have leaked was when he had to sue the CIA for discriminating against him when he was employed as their agent. And so Sterling claims to have tried to alert staff members of the Senate Intelligence Committee of the dangers of Operation Merlin. But this was done through not by leaking information, but by submitting warnings to the higher-ups. And in essence, like, the CIA just threw Sterling under the bus to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, essentially. Like, they were punishing Sterling for daring to expose discrimination in their agency, as well as blaming one person for all of their international failures. And that one person actually tried to stop that failure from happening. And in Sterling's article that he wrote while he was in prison after he was charged and found guilty of things that he did not do, he states that, quote, during the time in the CIA, it became clear in the organization's words and actions toward him that they saw him not as an American who wanted to serve his country, but as, quote, a big black guy, quote, and end quote. And so reading his book and then following it up with his article after, it made me really angry to realize that there were probably other instances where minority whistleblowers were shunned or even seen as the outsiders after bravely stepping up to fight for what is right and exposing corrupt institutions. You always hear about these heroic and daring whistleblowers who bravely expose their company for injustice by putting their careers and sometimes even their lives on the line. But the problem is that only white whistleblowers get that recognition and get that praise, and they're all white. So they have awards, they have recognition for their heroics, and some of them even got a Netflix documentary to compliment them. But where was that recognition for minority whistleblowers? Where was their Netflix show? Where was their award? And when Dr. Ronnie gave us our final project for a research opportunity, I jumped on the chance to delve into why minority whistleblowers weren't treated the same as their white counterparts. And it was inspired by a book I just possessed from a chance encounter, and then I was spurred on to see if any more whistleblowers received the same harassment and unfair treatment as Jeffrey Sterling did. And while doing my research, I realized that there's a reason why you don't hear about minority whistleblowers. And that's because the authority of their institutions, aka usually the white men in power, bullies them for daring to speak up and then further punishes them by encouraging their peers and then the public to do the same. And what makes them think it's okay to further threaten these whistleblowers by using their authority, not for protection, but then as a weapon? And the reason is hegemony. So, hegemony is the driving force behind the stigma that separates minority whistleblowers from gaining the same recognition as white whistleblowers. And the term was originated by an Italian communist called Antonio Gramsci. And the definition of hegemony claims that the dominant group in society, usually white men, sees their superiority over the subservient group, aka the minorities, due to the prestige and confidence granted to them by society. So the consent of the subservient group to be dominated is so deep-rooted in the daily lives of society that it is automatically given unconsciously. However, in order to keep that consent and the masses ignorant and therefore pliable, continuous indoctrinations need to be put in place by those white men in power. And so there's policies and microaggressions within institutions and companies, as well as the toxic culture within an institution that keeps employees from speaking out against authority. And so it keeps them pliable and keeps them subservient. And then when a group of people stand up for their ideals and then question the morality of this unknowing consent that they did not know they gave, seen by an act of rebellion by the white authority. And so when the subservient group stands up for what they believe to be justice, in this case, people of color bravely stepping up to fight for the injustice, whiteness swiftly delivers a cheating blow of humiliation and anything else it can do to silence the rebel. A company itself is a mini society with its own rule book. Usually, people of color are not given the same resources as their white employee counterparts, and so even if they do want to speak out, they're unable to translate their intentions into an actual movement that will elicit change within the company. And this is almost a universal occurrence in all institutions where people of color receive little to no aid as they're left alone to fend for themselves in a workplace. Take, for example, Dr. Marsha Coleman Adebayo. And according to NPR, she is a highly, highly educated Black woman who earned her doctoral degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, aka MIT, and she served in a high-ranking position in the Environmental Protection Agency. And while she was working, she discovered an American company in South Africa that was ignoring the health complaints of its South African workers. And so they were mining the substance vanadium, and many of those miners suffered from serious health problems. But when she brought up the issue with her superiors, she says that the agency reneged on promises to investigate the matter, and then the harder she pushed for change, the more of a backlash she faced from her superiors. And, quote, when she reported the situation to her supervisors, she was told to shut up and just decorate her office. And she adds that she faced death threats, rape threats, and that she felt that her family was in danger, end quote. When she was asked about the situation, she says, I was surprised that in the environment of the EPA, instead of being rewarded for being proficient in what you do, loyalty was a much greater value. When I began questioning US policy, I was considered disloyal. And at that point, at the many minds of the people at the EPA, I had become their enemy. End quote. And as you can see from this unfortunate example, that her superiors used hegemony for justifying their inexcusable actions for insulting her, since most of the people in the EPA already viewed her as an enemy for being a whistleblower. So they thought it was acceptable for her to go through this treatment instead of witnessing it and then stopping it. And since she is a person of color, they therefore saw her as someone that they could bully and that no one would come to her defense because the employers would side with the authority, either that they're too scared to speak out or because that they share the same racist views as the EPA authorities. And the EPA was embarrassed to be called out and exposed by a subordinate who happened to be a very highly educated Black woman. And so her supervisors felt embarrassed, and then they abused their status and position and power to subdue and humiliate her as a form of shameful retaliation. And then another example of where an agency would much rather bully the whistleblower instead of easily taking responsibility and rectifying their mistake is Sibel Edmonds, who is a 32-year-old Turkish American who was hired by a translator by the FBI shortly after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, because of her knowledge of Middle Eastern languages. And then she was fired less than a year later for reporting shoddy work and security breaches to her supervisors that could have easily prevented those 9/11 attacks. And Sibel Edmonds has been fighting the corruption permeating the FBI since her unfair dismissal, and she sued to contest her firing. However, quote, the government has employed the privilege to dismiss Edmonds' entire case in an effort to protect itself from embarrassment, end quote. Edmonds has also exposed that she was told to work slowly to give the appearance that the agency was overworked so that it would receive a larger budget, despite there being a large backlog of documents that needed translating. And even though she followed all the proper and appropriate procedures for reporting her concerns up the chain of command, Edmonds was retaliated against and fired. I mean, Edmonds had to battle discrimination within the workplace and discrimination once she was let go. And so she received no assistance from the justice system, and she certainly received no assistance from her former workplace, even though she followed all the necessary steps to bring these issues to light legally. And as a hegemonic display of power, the government pulled out all the stops to prevent her case from going through to the public by using the excuse that her case was dismissed as it contained the government's state secrets. And her superiors grossly misuses their position of power to stay in their position of power. And they don't care if one of their subordinates will be harmed through the process. And then another unfortunate example where there was again discrimination in the FBI is Bassem Youssef, who was a decorated FBI superior who was born in Egypt and speaks fluent Arabic. And he says that, quote, jealousy, discrimination, and flawed directives hinder the FBI's attempts to fight terrorism, end quote, in an article by USA Today, and that, quote, the FBI permitted racism to interfere with national security, end quote, according to the New York Times. Youssef, who is the highest ranking Arab American agent, has a discrimination lawsuit already pending against the Bureau, and he has also raised concerns about the FBI's alleged misuse of warrantless searches. Youssef also alleges that, quote, he was passed over for several promotions after the September 11, 2001 attacks, despite his relevant skills and experience, end quote. And upon hearing this, the FBI swiftly moved to cover its tracks by censorship and threats of disciplinary action towards Yusuf. And, quote, the FBI denies discriminating against him and says it now has 46 agents and 285 language analysts who speak at least conversational Arabic, end quote. There's almost this universal pattern within all people of color in what they face. Like most, if not all of them, have experienced discrimination at the workplace and doors being shut on them just for not being white. Like Yusuf mentioned in his lawsuit that, quote, he was passed over for several promotions after September 11, despite his relevant skills and experience, end quote. And reading this immediately drew a connection to Kathy Hong's book called Minor Feelings when she writes, quote, this country insists that our racial identity is besides the point, that it has nothing to do with being bullied or passed over for a promotion or cut off every time we talk, end quote. And then, almost like clockwork, after being hit with a discrimination charge, the FBI pulls the I have black friends card by immediately listing how many of their other agents that they've hired that are able to fill Yusuf's shoes. It's kind of like saying, no, we didn't discriminate against him because we have other agents of his nationality that are able to do his job and we haven't done anything to them, so therefore we haven't done anything to him. I mean, it's just as Hong had said, that the FBI wants a way to clear up the excuse that Yusuf wasn't discriminated against because of his race, but because of other logistics like his performance in his job. But that was just an excuse that they gave. And then by showing how many other employees of color the agencies hired, they use those people as a performance act. Okay. Now, you might be thinking, okay, you've proved that minority whistleblowers are clearly discriminated against, but then where's the proof that white whistleblowers are not treated any differently? And so I have that proof for you right here. In 2002, Time magazine named 3 whistleblowers as Persons of the Year. And so congratulations to FBI agent Colleen Rowley, who called the Bureau on the carpet for ignoring evidence hinting at the September 11 terrorist attacks, and Cynthia Cooper, a WorldCom vice president who told the company's board of directors about nearly $4 billion in accounting irregularities. And finally, former Aeron vice president Sharon Watkins, according to CNN. These 3 women have done tremendous things to deserve the title of Person of the Year. However, was it a coincidence that all of these women were white? I mean, where was Basim Yusuf, the FBI's highest Arab American agent, who I previously mentioned, who, quote, has placed his career in jeopardy in order to ensure that the FBI can properly protect the public against another terrorist attack, end quote, after 9/11, according to the New York Times. And so an interesting pattern that I've noticed that is in the article by CNN expressing the accomplishments of these women is that besides the title, Time names whistleblowers as Persons of the Year, nowhere else does it refer to these women as whistleblowers. Instead, the word hero is given to these women to describe their daring deeds. And Time actually said that, quote, the 3 are women of ordinary demeanor, but exceptional guts and sense, end quote. And I actually, after reading this, went back to the articles that were written about Dr. Marsha Coleman Adebayo and Sybil Edmonds and Basim Yusuf. After reading this, and nowhere else in any of the articles name them as heroes. Nowhere else. The articles don't even paint them in such a praising light as Time did for the 3 white women. And the refusal of both Time and CNN to use the word whistleblower as a label probably has to do with the stigma that surrounds the word, and then the negative stereotypes that whistleblower would bring up if it were used to describe the women. And so time's run out for this episode, so we'll pick it back here next time. Thank you for tuning into While You Whistle, and be sure to stay tuned for the next episode. Roll outro!